Before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear didn't happen in some glossy American city. It happened in the dust and heat of a West African market, where people measure their lives in handfuls of rice and promises made to landlords who wait with patient menace. This is about a 6-year-old boy with bare feet and open palms. A boy who sat at the edge of a roadside every morning, voice quiet enough not to frighten anyone away, asking for just enough to keep his mother alive a little longer. And about the woman behind a food stall who gave him what she had, not knowing that years later, a folded piece of paper in a battered tin would reveal a truth that would restore everything they'd lost. If you think this is a fairy tale, you're wrong. If you think this ends with a magical revelation and everyone clapping, you're wrong. This is about the slow, painful work of making things right, about how small acts of dignity can compound over years into something that looks like justice. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe because stories like this don't get told enough. And comment, "I'm listening," if you're ready to hear what really happens when the invisible become visible. Let's begin. Every morning, before the sun burned the dust into light, a small pair of hands would appear at the edge of the roadside, palms open, voice quiet. They belonged to Austin. He was 6 years old, thin. He moved with that careful economy children learn when they've been living on the edge of hunger for a long time. He smelled of starch and the faint sharpness of charcoal smoke. His feet were bare when the market was muddy, and dust collected in the hollows of his knees like a secret. He did not shout. He did not ask for much. A wrapper of rice, a spoonful of stew, an old cup of water, small things that kept his mother alive a little longer. Nora watched him from behind the counter of her tiny stall. She was a lean woman in her late 20s with silk-scarfed hair and hands that had learned the rhythm of survival by making a steady living from frying dough, layering soft yams with pepper sauce, and keeping a pot on the boil. Her business was not much, just a couple of benches, a low roof of corrugated iron, a chalkboard with yesterday's prices smeared by rain. But what she sold had a kind of truth that made people come back. Her food was honest food, warm, spicy, and full of the kind of careful seasoning that reminded people of home. Austin would come, and Nora would watch him from the corner of her eye as she packed takeaway in torn plastic. Sometimes she would slip a small extra bowl into his packet, sometimes a warm ladleful of stew wrapped in foil. He rarely spoke. He took the food as if collecting a trust, and his eyes, big and soft, said thank you in a way that no words could have. Nora did not call her actions charity. She simply could not stand the idea of a child eating nothing when she had food she could spare. She remembered hunger like a bruise, and believed that small mercies were what kept people whole. So she would slide a warm packet across her counter with the same casualness as passing change. People who watched saw only a kind woman. Only Nora knew that sometimes she tightened her own belt at night to be sure there was something in Austin's bowl the next day. At home, under a sun-faded sheet stretched over a narrow bed in a single-room dwelling behind the market, Vivian lay with her face turned to the window. Her breath had the thinness of someone who woke up to find the world had grown heavier to carry. She slept a lot now, and sometimes, in mornings when she was awake, she would hum an old song that had no words left, only melody. Austin would put a spoon to her lips and feed her with the small, solemn devotion of a child whose role had been rewritten by disease. The disease had a name, the clinic had said slowly, and the word had felt like a stone they rolled through the family circle until it lay heavy at the center. The treatments were long and costly, and Vivian's wages, what little she had ever earned, disappeared into hospital corridors and the hush of doctors' rooms. Their little savings vanished. Neighbors came with small coins or leftover yams. The landlord, gentle and menacing in his patience, accepted a promise for this month's rent. That was how life bent toward survival, with promises, favors, an economy of kindness. It was not dramatic in the way stories often are. There were no sweeping gestures at first. There were the small, repetitive miracles. A bowl left by a stranger outside the door. A neighbor's coat thrown over Vivian's feet at night. Nora's lunch packed an extra minute earlier so Austin could be fed before selling the next round. On market days, the air was full of voices and heat. Cassava smoke mixed with exhaust. A motorbike coughed past, and a woman's laugh spilled into the clatter. The corner where Nora stood always smelled of frying oil and scalded yam. She had a small radio propped under the scale. The music sometimes kept her hands from tiring. Austin's feet dug into the packed dirt. He would sit on the step and watch the world move without him, chewing slowly when there was food, counting each bite like a blessing. If anyone had asked him where his father was, or where he had been before they came here, his answer would have been thin silence. He knew the shape of a man's absence like a memory of someone who once brushed the back of his neck at night. He knew his mother's name and her laugh that came in the afternoons when she felt strong enough to tell him a fragment of a story. He knew the small treasury she kept, a battered tin beneath a loose board that sometimes contained a folded photograph and a paper with faint, careful writing on it. Neither Nora nor Austin was careless with that photograph. It was old and frayed at the edges. The image caught two young people smiling under a low sign. A picture of a small restaurant with hand-painted letters. A place where people had once eaten and been glad. In the background of that photograph, a man with a shy smile, Gabriel, had his arm around Vivian. The spot on the paper where Austin's name was written had been folded so many times the ink had feathered into the fibers like a whisper. Sometimes, when Vivian could be lucid enough to talk, she would touch the photograph and tell Austin stories about the place behind the sign. "One day we will be back there," she would say, in a voice that tried to hold hope steady. Austin would nod and tuck the photo back into the tin like a treasure he was guarding against the long, slow leak of time. Out in the world beyond the market, there were different summers. Gabriel had left years ago, carrying a suitcase and a promise. He had gone abroad and built a life that glinted with things measured in numbers, buildings, bank accounts, a name in the right columns. In photographs of his life overseas, he wore suits that fit like a second skin. He learned to move in rooms that echoed with people who measured success by the shape of their watches. But there was always the ache. Sometimes it woke him at night like an animal pacing up and down in a cage. There were small private rituals he performed to keep that ache contained. He would go through old envelopes and find the same photograph of a young couple in front of a restaurant, and for a moment the world would tilt back to a place where he had been less sure of his hands but certain of his love. He would put the photograph back in its box and tell himself he had done the sensible thing. He had left so they would have a better chance. He had been careful, he told himself. He had sent money sometimes. He had not known that care could wear thin like old rope. The years did not heal Gabriel's sense of guilt. They honed it into a quiet blade he kept in an inside pocket. He told himself he was a man of means now, and that meant responsibility. He could write checks, he could build clinics, he could erect signs with names in bold letters if he wanted to. The thought of returning, of stepping back into the dust and the rhythms of the market, scared him more than the idea of any board meeting abroad. It was one thing to give aid at a distance. It was quite another to stand in front of the person who had been there when you left. Back at the stall, Nora noticed that Austin's visits became more frequent. He came at odd hours now, long before the market filled with noise, and stayed after the plates were cleared. There were times when his eyes were swollen. He had been weeping quietly in the night and then cutting his tears into the day like a secret habit. He never complained, but he sometimes looked older than his 6 years in the way he watched the sky. Nora found herself slipping into the role she had never planned on, an older sister, a neighbor. Someone who put an extra scrap of stew into a bowl and then stood, chin set, and did not let anyone take it. The community around them was not blind to suffering. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. eBay, carried a bag of produce once a week and always found a way to leave it at Vivian's door. A security guard who made his rounds at the edge of the market sometimes gave them small tokens from the night shift. But the wind that blew through their lives was mostly one of small, recurrent kindnesses, accumulated like coins in a child's palm. It was enough to keep the heart beating. It was not enough to pay for the tuneless, cold machinery of modern medicine. One evening, with the sunset turned copper on the corrugated roofs, Vivian's breath grew labored. Austin held her hand. Nora was there, frying a final batch of dough, when a young driver from a clinic in the city pulled up, breathless and apologetic. He had been called by a neighbor who finally did what sorrow sometimes does. It breaks through the barrier of despair and takes action. The clinic's corridors smelled of antiseptic and electricity. Machines hummed. People moved with the steady competence of a place where emergencies were routine. The doctor who spoke to them had a soft voice and clear eyes. He did not promise miracles. He explained the options, treatment plans, tests, a waiting list that was longer than the month's bills. Names of procedures were spoken with the professionalism of someone who had to keep hope tethered to plausibility. Gabriel, in his city abroad, felt the pull like a string tugging at his sleeve. He could not shake the image of the photograph and the whisper of a name folded into a tin. He booked a ticket with hands that did not quite remember how to choose flights home. The flight cabin was an island of neutral, soft light. Its hum reminded him of hospital machines and far-off rooftops. He watched the landscape change beneath him from pattern to pattern. The city receding into smaller patterns, then the wider chaos of rural roofs, and finally the city proper, a dense map of lives intersecting. Arrival for Gabriel was not triumphant. He had not rehearsed the words he would say. There were no speeches. He carried with him a bag that had a tendency to rattle with practicality. Documents, an address he had remembered from an old bank transfer, a name he had not dared speak aloud in the years since he had gone. He kept the photograph folded carefully in his pocket, pressing it gently to keep the edges from unraveling. If he had been honest with himself, he would have admitted that the act of coming was half obligation and half seeking. A need to be forgiven by the only people who could grant it without the spectacle of a public audience. He found the market by asking directions, first from a taxi driver who remembered a restaurant sign by the bridge, then from a woman who said, "You mean Vivian? She is the one with the boy." The path between his memory and the present was crowded with small changes. A new billboard near the bypass, a streetlight where there had been none. Yet the stall where Nora sold her food looked like a hinge in the city, catching all the movement and holding it together. When Gabriel came to the corner where Nora stood, he did so with a cautiousness that felt like confession. People glanced but did not stare. He had not intended to announce himself. He only wanted to know he had not been forgotten, that the photograph had not been a lie of nostalgia. Nora looked up and, for a moment, simply watched him, an unembroidered gaze that took him in and then returned to the day. Vivian's recovery, once the clinic took her in, was a sequence of patient, stubborn days. The machines and the hands that knew how to steady them did their work. There were hours when the progress was a tiny, steady line upward, and hours when it seemed like the scale tilted back again. Gabriel spent the nights in the waiting room, sitting on a plastic chair and watching the fluorescent light as if it might be a lantern that could guide a ship. He spoke to no one at first. When he did speak, he used small words. Apology did not come out as an explanation. It came as presence. He would hold Vivian's hand and the photograph on the bedside table, and sometimes he would touch the corner of the paper, as if to prove it was not a dream. At the hospital, Nora and Austin were not marginalized. The staff treated them with practical respect. A nurse who had children of his own made a rule of smoothing Austin's hair when he came to visit, and a cleaner left small sweets in his pocket when her rounds allowed. Gabriel paid for treatments that the clinic accepted without fanfare. He refused to make a show of his checkbooks or to lay out his wealth as a display. There was a quiet accountability in his gestures. He signed what needed signing, he listened to the medical professionals when they explained options, and he asked about long-term plans for Vivian's care. "She needs more than medicine," one doctor said quietly to him in the corridor, not as reproach but as a fact. "She needs support, a place where she will be able to rest without fear. These things cost time and organization as much as they do money." Gabriel understood that sentence the way you understand a map in a storm. You look for landmarks and hold them tightly. He thought of Nora and the stall and the way the woman had fed a barefoot child without demand. He remembered the photograph, a sign, a tiny restaurant, hands clasped in a way that meant belonging. Little by little, he began to make plans that tried, awkwardly, to be more than compensation for years of absence. While Vivian stayed in the hospital, small routines knitted themselves around her bed. Austin slept on the hard chair and sometimes woke to the beep of machines. He compared the letters to the ones on the photograph and felt a small electric thrill. The name matched the one Austin carried like a secret in his pocket. That evening, in the little room where the roof leaked when it rained, Gabriel sat across from Vivian and looked at her as if at a map he wanted to read carefully. "Tell me everything," he said. He did not command, he invited. She looked up at him with the weary patience of someone who had been holding disappointment for a long time, and who had learned that words had weight and could break more than one thing when thrown without care. "I protected what I could," Vivian said slowly, fingers finding the edge of the photograph. "I didn't want them to take our land when times got hard. I put it away. I thought if I left with the boy, it would be a safeguard." Her voice carried no accusation, only a kind of exhausted precision. She had protected what she had in the way someone ties a knot, careful, exact, making sure it would hold. The paper Gabriel held had marks that looked like an official seal, but the specifics of the document remained uncertain until someone with the right knowledge could say for sure. No one in that tiny room pretended to be a lawyer. What they did have was an old paper, a name, and the patient, stubborn insistence of memory. Gabriel kept his promise to be present. He paid for the clinic bills, yes, but he did more than that. He reached out to people who could help make sense of the old paper, asking questions in tones that showed urgency without fanfare. He did not throw a wad of cash at the problem and walk away. He asked, respectfully, what would be the right way to honor whatever history that paper implied. It mattered to him, suddenly, to do something that was less about absolving himself and more about making right the quiet wrongs that had accumulated. Nora watched the man who had appeared with measured steps. She did not assume he had come to buy himself a conscience. She had seen many men whose sympathy arrived like a fashion and left just as quickly. But she saw him come into the ward and sit, and when he looked at Vivian, he did not turn away. That, more than the wallet in his hand, was what tilted something inside her. The plan for the future began to take shape as small, practical things. There would be a place. Nora's kitchen, Gabriel suggested, where the market's cooking could be presented with dignity. A modest restaurant with benches and a small sign. Gabriel proposed something more than a handout. Education for Nora. A partnership that would ensure she could run the place. A plan to employ local workers. A training period so that she could manage accounts and the frantic life of a small business. He wanted to give a structure that could last, not just a single dramatic check. "People need to be able to buy into their future," he told Vivian once, looking at the photograph where their younger selves smiled under the restaurant's sign. "They have to have a stake." Nora listened carefully when Gabriel presented his ideas. She did not say they were impossible. She asked practical, precise questions about how this would be run. She wanted to know who would teach her bookkeeping. She wanted to know where the supplies would come from. She cared about the dignity of work and the fact that begging would no longer be part of Austen's life. She wanted Austen to go to school, to learn without the hunger twisting his attention away. Gabriel listened and nodded. There was responsibility in the way he promised. Not theatrical apologies, but concrete steps. As plans were pitched and softened, the town watched with a curious eye. Word spread slowly from neighbor to neighbor. "There is a man helping Vivian," someone said. And like a rumor that wants to be true, it evolved. People wondered about the nature of help. Was it a gift? Was it a paternal show? In the marketplace, people whispered and folded their curiosities into the ordinary rhythm of the day. At the edge of this new movement, the photograph kept showing itself like a compass. It was Gabriel's map back to a time when everything had still felt possible. It was Vivian's memory of a life where a small restaurant had been the center of a modest universe. It was Austen's inheritance in a way he did not yet understand. Something kept, something trusted. One afternoon, while the sun lay in the shape of a coin over the roofs, Gabriel sat with the old paper on his lap and watched Austen play near the hospital garden. The boy crouched and arranged a line of small stones with a thoughtful face that looked older than his years. Gabriel bent closer without thinking and saw the name Vivian had written on the back of a tiny folded scrap that had been tucked inside the tin. It matched the letters on the old paper. The sight tightened something in him like a vow remembered. He did not speak of ownership in loud terms. He spoke instead of care and protection. But the question rose naturally in his mind. What if the paper really did point to a more concrete claim? What if Vivian's cautiousness, her tendency to protect by hiding things away, had created a legal trace that belonged, by right, to the child she was protecting? The thought carried the tendency to complicate everything. Ownership is a sharp word in places where people have had to sell what little they own to survive. But ownership can also be reclaimed in ways that restore dignity rather than diminish it. Gabriel felt this difference keenly. He was not interested in using legalities to parade his heroism. He wanted to make sure that whatever history existed would be used to give Austen a stable place in the world. For his own reasons, partly of guilt and partly of an honest desire to right wrongs, Gabriel reached out to a lawyer whose name he had been given by a neighbor. The lawyer's office smelled of paper and coffee. She read the document slowly, her pen tracing lines like a cartographer. "This needs verification," she said. "Some of this might be formal. Some of it might be more informal. Memories that were never made official. We will have to check, and that will take time." But even before the law could be consulted properly, people around the market began to sense a shift. Gabriel, who had been a ghost in memories, was now a man whose presence pulsed like a new engine. There was talk of a restaurant that might be built, perhaps named for Nora. There was talk, in quieter corners, of the child from the corner who had a name on a paper that some believed might give him a stake in something. The community's response was not simple. For some, it was a moment to celebrate, a family being restored, a woman being given a chance to uplift herself. For others, it was a moment to ask hard questions. Who has the right to give? Who has the right to receive? There was a thin line between help that humbles and help that dignifies. Nora, with a patience that had been shaped by long practice, decided that she would not be a passive recipient of anyone's benevolence. She agreed to learn bookkeeping, to take training, to be part of the team that would make the restaurant a living endeavor. She negotiated, quietly but fiercely, the terms of her involvement. She wanted to keep her voice in the project. She wanted work that honored her. Gabriel listened and respected the only thing that mattered to her, the ability to keep working without shame. As plans were made, a community meeting was held in the open square near the market. Neighbors gathered under the shade of a great mango tree. Some came to congratulate. Some came to ask practical questions. Others came simply to watch how the city would redistribute a story about redemption. Gabriel stood, awkward and sincere and spoke little. He spoke of partnership, of employing local people, of supporting education. He spoke of a child and a mother and the need to be accountable. Austin sat on the edge of the crowd, his knees up against his chin. He listened with the careful curiosity that children have when the world speaks in grown-up languages. He did not understand all the terms, title, ownership, partnership, but he felt the warmth of a promise and the way adult voices softened when they looked at him. That night, as the town settled, Gabriel lay awake thinking of what the paper might mean. He thought of his own failures and the long ledger of missed years. He did not seek absolution. He sought to make progress. He had an old photograph and a new responsibility. He had a child whose small hands were only just learning to hold the spoon steady enough to feed a mother. He had a document that might, if verified, return something more valuable than land, a sense of belonging. If you're still with me, this is where I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that small acts of kindness matter. Comment below and tell me if you've ever helped someone without expecting anything back. Because what comes next is when everything that's been building finally comes together, and you need to hear how it ends. The next morning, a small convoy of people came to Nora's stall carrying a whiteboard, a small folding table, and a modest portable stove. It was the beginning of putting plans into motion. A drawing of a menu, a schedule for training, a list of local suppliers. The town watched, and something like hope rearranged itself in the market's geometry. Austin watched too, from his place on the step. He understood in the way children do, by feeling, by absorbing the tones around him, that something was shifting. And then, as the sun climbed, Gabriel walked over to the boy. He crouched down so he was at Austin's height and put the old photograph between his palms. The child looked at it, then at Gabriel, and then at the paper that had been stitched into their life like a secret seam. For a second there was the same silence that had always been between them, the silence of things that are difficult to name. Gabriel's voice was soft. "Do you know who this is?" he asked. Austin blinked, touched the edge of the photograph, and said, in his small, exact voice, "My mama." Gabriel smiled with a kind of sudden relief that was almost weak. "Yes," he said, "yes, your mama." He had planned to say more. He had planned to explain that he had come back not to fix everything at once, but to stand and to help. He had planned to tell Austin, perhaps, that there were things, papers, old photographs, small stamped documents, that might belong to them in a way none of them had expected. He did not say those words yet. The language felt too big for the first morning. Across the market, a neighbor who had always been good at noticing things observed Gabriel's hands on the paper and then glanced at the little boy. She muttered to herself, a small note of wonder that would become a whisper. "If that paper is what I think it is." The clue had been planted earlier. An old photograph. The faded name on the scrap inside the tin. Gabriel's quiet reaction when he saw Austin arrange pebbles. And now it began to take shape in the minds of those who watched. It was not a revelation yet. It was the soft gathering of facts, the kind of momentum that precedes a confession. Gabriel made an appointment with the local registry. He did not parade the idea in the marketplace. He did not want to turn the child's life into spectacle. He wanted, rather, to verify whether the paperwork that had been preserved in a tin and a woman's memory had any effect in the world of official stamps and ink. The lawyer's advice had been cautious. "We will check the archives. We must be careful about how we proceed. There are steps and procedures, and we must respect them." But even as the law prepared its slow, exacting machinery, different hearts began to rearrange themselves. Nora prepared menus and training schedules, her movements steady. Vivian's breaths, monitored and measured, displayed a slow but visible steadiness. Gabriel arranged for a place for Austin to attend a nearby school. Small but true steps that would shape the boy's future into something with margins and timelines. The city hummed in its ordinary way while these quiet changes took place. There were moments of sudden tenderness, like the time Gabriel, tired from a long morning of calls and small tasks, bought Austin a pair of shoes that fit properly for the first time. The boy tried them on and ran a little way down the lane, as if measuring his new stride in a world that had always moved faster than he could. People clapped. A neighbor called out that the boy looked like a gentleman. Austin laughed, the sound of a child's honest surprise at comfort. As work began on the modest restaurant plan, there were more questions in the air. Had the paper actually registered the restaurant under a child's name? Could anyone legally place ownership with a minor? Gabriel's lawyer reappeared with practical counsel. There were mechanisms to secure a child's future without placing impossible burdens on them. The details, forms, guardianship arrangements, and the like remained uncertain until properly arranged. The law's language would be careful. The community's emotions were not. For now, they moved with care, letting the next steps be small and deliberate. A sign would be put up, but not yet. Training would start, but the ownership question was still a thin thread held loosely. The people around them sensed, however, that something unusual was preparing to happen. They sensed that a child's small life, once reduced to the economy of a single day's meal, was being woven back into a larger fabric. It was on such an ordinary afternoon, while the market's voices braided into a single hum, that the first public gathering was scheduled. A small event to introduce Nora's kitchen to the neighborhood. It was to be modest. Placards, a few folding chairs, a tiny table for speeches. But it would bring people together. Gabriel insisted there be no parade, no show, only an honest presentation of plans and the community's involvement. When the day came, people arrived as they always did. Some out of curiosity, some because they liked Nora's food, and others because change has a way of being gossip's favorite subject. Austin sat near the front, his small hands folded in his lap. Vivian, wrapped in a shawl and looking more rested than she had in months, sat beside him. Gabriel stood with his palms open, a man whose guilt had been tempered into action. Speeches were short. Nora spoke of hard work, of books she'd read on business, of wanting to create a place where people would come to eat and feel seen. She spoke without ceremony, but with a fierce, quiet joy. Gabriel spoke about accountability and partnership and the need for people to build institutions that last. The lawyer, in neutral tones, explained there were details to be checked before any legal names could be placed on a sign or on a title, and that they would proceed carefully. Austin listened. His eyes followed the movement of faces, and then he reached into his pocket and produced the folded scrap of paper that Vivian had been so careful with. He unfolded it and, without theatrics, laid it on the table. The act was small, a child presenting a piece of paper. But the paper had a name, and the name matched the faded letters on the old document Gabriel had unearthed. For a moment, the market grew quiet in that particular way towns have when something fragile and true is placed in public. People leaned forward, not out of hunger for spectacle, but because small truths require witnesses. Gabriel's face moved through a dozen expressions: surprise, a touch of fear, then a kind of sorrow that had the shape of readiness. He did not seize the moment like a man preening for praise. Instead, he reached toward the paper as if to touch an old memory and not to make it perform. "That paper," one neighbor said softly, "belongs to the child's mother." "It could be a record of what was ours long ago," another voice said. "Or it could be something else." The topic was not settled. The law still had to say its piece. The paper was a thread, not yet a cloth. What it promised, however, was more than just property. It promised recognition. That someone had remembered to keep something safe. That someone had preserved a small claim against a future that might have taken everything. For a group that had been taught to accept what came, this small bed of resistance, the fact of preservation, felt like a quiet victory. Gabriel, standing with the world watching, did something that startled everyone. He asked that the community witness not just the potential legal process, but the way they would choose to proceed together. "If there is any rightful claim in that document," he said, voice steady, "we will make sure it is handled with care. I am not looking to shame anyone or to turn this into a spectacle. I am only responsible for what I helped break." His words landed not as self-flagellation, but as a promise. There was no flourish, there was accountability. A woman in the crowd, a neighbor who had seen Vivian's family before the years of sickness, leaned forward. "We remember," she said. "We remember a small place and the